Okay, James, would you like to clap? Do the clap. Perfect. Thank you. So thank you for being here today. So this seminar is the first in a series of seminars from ILCA 4's Création culturelle et territoire, transversal axis entitled Climate Fictions, which aims to explore different types of climate fiction, both in literature and the visual arts, from an English-speaking perspective. So for this first seminar, we have chosen to invite Peter Mathews, who is a professor of English literature at Macau University in China. And he will be talking about The Belle of the World by Australian author Gregory Day. So I'll let you introduce Peter D. Mathews.
Okay. So, Peter D. Mathews is a tenured full professor of English literature in the Department of English at the University of Macau. After completing a PhD in comparative literature and cultural studies at Monash University in 2002, he worked for nearly a decade as an academic in the United States before moving to Asia in 2010. So his research focuses mainly on modern and contemporary British fiction, Australian literature, and critical theory. He's the author of 3 academic books in these fields, including Lacan the Charlatan, English Magic and Imperial Madness, 2021, and From Poet to Novelist, The Orphic Journey of John A. Scott. He is currently working on a book about the Australian author Rodney Hall, and as the Australians say, he's a bloody good bloke.
Thanks, James.
And the respondent will be Christine Van Damme, who is here. She is a senior lecturer at Grenoble-Alpes University, where she teaches British literature in the 19th century, as well as post-colonial literature in the 20th century. Her field of expertise is that of space, place, and literature, but also space, place, and identity from a narratological and deconstructive perspective. But also with a particular interest in the ideological, political, and ethical implications of such spatial representations. She did her PhD on Patrick White and the representation of space, among other authors. Yes, okay, I forgot about that. Lately, she has published mostly on the representation of space and place in Australia, with a particular focus on non-Indigenous Australian perceptions and visions of the bush, as well as what Indigenous Australians call country, whether literary and cultural or pictorial. She co-edited a volume on space, place, and hybridity in national imagination in the English-speaking post-colonial world with André Dodman in 2021. And she is currently working on the notion of resurgence and invisibility, and to what extent art can provide a space of negotiation, cultural and political exchange, and ethical co-imagination of future imagined nations. So that will be for the second part. So for now, we're going to listen to Peter Mathews. Thank you.
All right, well, let me begin by saying what a pleasure it is to be here with you. Thank you so much to James for inviting me. I've known James for several years, since we met at Ian McEwan conference in the University Con Normandie. And then, of course, Marie and Christine as well for doing a lot of the heavy lifting behind the scenes as well. So I really thank you to all 3 of you for inviting me, and it's a real pleasure to be here. Right, so my topic, Towards an Ethics of Receptivity, reading Gregory Day's The Belle of the World. For the Australian author Gregory Day, the problem of the modern world problems of the modern world arise from the fact that we have forgotten how to listen, leaving us unreceptive to what he calls the music of nature. Day's oeuvre is a testament to his own willingness to observe his closest surroundings, with his fiction inevitably originating in the coastal landscapes of Bass Strait that provide the overriding creative force of my work. So you can see on the map here, if you're not familiar with the area of Bass Strait, this is the southeast of Australia. You can see Melbourne down there, and so basically from Geelong along here, this is the area that he's focusing on. And his fourth novel set on this island, King Island. Day's reputation as an Australian author of note has grown over the past few years, starting with the Mungawak trilogy of novels with which he began his career. These are The Patron Saint of Eels from 2005, Ron McCoy's Sea of Diamonds 2008, and The Grand Hotel 2010, which are all set in this area, for instance. So they're all set in that little coastal area. The name Mungawak is an indigenous word that refers to the southeastern border of the Tarocha clan of the Wadawurrung, which is the local tribe, and means a good place to hunt swans. In his 2019 essay, One True Note, The Meaning of Sound in the Language of Place from 2019, Day reflects how in Australia, traditional names like Mungawak exist in tension with the language and labels imposed by colonisation. The trilogy itself thus centres on an exploration of how small-town life in the region struggles to come to terms with this legacy, all filtered through Day's environmentally connected romantic spirituality that is epitomised by this epigraph from the patron saint of eels. If the sun and moon should doubt, they'd immediately go out, which is taken, of course, from William Blake's poem Auguries of Innocence from 1803. The opening lines of that same poem, in which Blake urges his readers famously to see a world in a grain of sand and thus hold infinity in the palm of your hand, provide the basic logic by which Day, as his career has unfolded, has increasingly moved beyond these regional limits to consider humanity's receptivity to the universe at large, allowing him to confront issues like environmental damage and climate change on a more global scale. The trajectory of Day's success begins with the 2015 novel, Archipelago of Souls. Shortlisted for the Tasmanian Book Prize, the novel is the one in which he first begins to explore the world beyond the Mungawak region. Set in the aftermath of World War II, Day's fourth novel centres on an Australian soldier who fought for the Allies in Crete, in Greece, returning to his home on King Island in Bass Strait after the war, only to find himself struggling with his inner demons. The archipelago in the book's title provides Day with a conceptual link between Greece and Tasmania, with the inspiration for the book first coming to him during a youthful visit to the island of Crete. He says in that interview, "My eyes were open in many ways during those days, not only to the sea-lit slopes and valleys of the classical world of Minoan and Homeric myth, but also to the more recent events that occurred on the island when Australians fought alongside the Cretans and the Kiwis and British in the Second World War. It's taken me years to find a way, but I knew back then that the idea of a relatively raw, young Australian man being thrown into such a historically layered yet awful situation was something I would write about. I've made constant sketches since, scribbling down many notes on the different yet strangely similar landscapes of the Mediterranean and where I live on the southwest coast of Victoria, and comparing the young, myth-seeking culture of Australia with the ancient, myth-bound society of Crete. What happened back in 1941 when these two cultures intersected in such dramatic circumstances? I wondered what happened on the inside." By creating a juxtaposition between these two contexts, Archipelago of Souls extends Day's fictional world beyond the usual limits of his local environment, drawing points of comparison across the boundaries of geography, time, and culture. The book's protagonist, Wesley Cress, provides the reader with an entry point into a conceptual network that extends outward from King Island to encompass the wider world. This dynamic intensifies in Day's next novel, A Sand Archive, it's called, published in 2018, which was shortlisted for the Miles Franklin Award, Australia's highest literary honour, and also earned Day the prestigious Patrick White Award. The book tells the story of a character by the name of F.B. Herschel, a civil engineer whose biography is recounted by a distant acquaintance who worked at the bookstore in Geelong that Herschel used to frequent. The narrator's interest is aroused by the discovery that Herschel wrote a self-published book called, this is a fictional book, but a self-published book, The Great Ocean Road, Dune Stabilization and Other Engineering Difficulties, which despite its dull-sounding title, he tells us, contains flashes of poetic inspiration that speak to the engineer's familiarity with French literature and culture. The main story of Herschel's life, as reconstructed from various archival resources, focuses on his proposal to use imported grass to stabilize the sand that lies beneath the Great Ocean Road. To validate this idea to the necessary authorities, Herschel receives a government scholarship to observe how similar processes have been used in France. Upon arriving in Paris, he visits a museum to see Piet Mondrian's early paintings of sand dunes, and during his time there, he also meets a young woman named Mathilde, a revolutionary who gets him embroiled in the events of May 1968. The driving force really is to take a character from my very small local regional area and pop them into a major philosophical crisis in Europe, explains Day, and to watch how the grid of culture can never contain the sand of nature. Despite their mutual attraction, Mathilde and Herschel eventually go their separate ways. She to continue her pursuit of an ideal of social justice, he back to Australia, where he abandons his scheme because he has come to regard the grass as too invasive a species to justify its undoubted capacity to stabilize the dune landscape. Herschel's split with Mathilde and his reversal on the use of imported grass are both the product of a new skepticism drawn from his observations in France about the inability of the current paradigm of human thought to solve a deeper crisis, one that is rooted in the implicit arrogance of humanity's relationship to the natural environment. In an interview on the ABC's book show, Day elaborates by contending that the events of 1968 were the result of a crisis of an imbalance between nature and culture, and the way the grid of culture had been placed upon the more analog, organic, and fluid forms of nature. The blindness of all modern political discourses, reactionary and revolutionary, derives from their inability, at least this is Day's position, derives from their inability to understand that nature does not easily conform to human political ideals. And so he writes in A Sand Archive, but sand isn't like that. It will not stay within the frame. And sand dunes, the forms that sand makes, come about not with open ease, but in a turbulence created by limitation. They take shape like young love itself in the shadow of obstacles. It could be a wind-sculpted plant, it may be a dysfunctional family, or in wider, more conceptual terms, it could find its form in the lee of a patriarchal resistance to a flexible proposal for the revolution of the world. Whatever the case, the sand, as it formed in the shadow of the obstacle personage that was known in 1968 by the name of Charles de Gaulle, was made up of 1 million cellular impulses, organic motions, continuities, and disjunctures. Herschel thus observes in the aftermath of the May 1968 protests how the cobblestones that for centuries the people of Paris had used as their weapons against what they considered to be oppressive or unjust regimes are being paved over by the bitumen trucks that come on de Gaulle's orders to seal the fate of history. He detects a repeated pattern in French history. His views on 1968 inflected not only by the famous dates of 1789 1848 and the Commune of 1870, but also by a largely forgotten ruling from 1828, when cattle were officially outlawed on the streets of Paris and nature had been forced to make way olfactorily, muddily in all its desirous unpredictability. Such grand projects are now seen for what they are, he concludes, violent impositions on our natural inheritance by a willfully ignorant human society. Day's most recent novel, The Bell of the World, reenacts this conflict between nature and society, when a fictional small town located in Mangawak territory on the southeast coast of Australia debates whether or not to install a bell to ring the hours. The faction in favour of this measure, led by the faction in favour of this measure, led by the pompous Selwyn Atchison, regards the town as being spiritually, civically, communally naked without the bell. As such, he advocates for its installation out of his own Presbyterian need for a bell to civilize, indeed, to drown out the pollinating salt airs of this small inlet into and out of the sea. Atchison seeks the support of a wealthy and influential fellow farmer, Fernshaw Fernie Hutchison, so Atchison and Hutchinson, the latter expressing his opposition to the project by recalling what happened when his grandfather Edward erected such a bell on a hill near Geelong. Upon noticing several members of the Wadawurrung tribe approaching, an implicit threat to the colonisers, Edward had rung the bell vigorously only to find that none of his so-called settler friends came to his aid as they had promised. He accordingly threw the bell, which told nothing but cowardice, disloyalty, ineffectuality, and moral disgrace, into the Moorabool River in disgust, vowing to the Indigenous peoples that they'd never hear a bell rung so here, a promise that Fernie intends to keep now that he has inherited his grandfather's land. Fernie thus rejects the implicit colonial symbolism of the bell by relating the tale of his grandfather to Atchison. Intertwined with this imperial theme is Day's recurrent concern in his fiction with the impending disaster of climate change. It often seems to me that the whole world's a poem and life's just about learning how to read it, he muses Riley in one interview, if, of course, the current warping of our climate allows me to. Yet there is something idiosyncratic about Day's decision in The Bell of the World to look backward through time to consider this theme. A brief survey of the seminal classics of this subgenre, John Christopher's The Death of Grass, 1956, J.G. Ballard's The Crystal World, 1966, Ursula K. Le Guin's The Lathe of Heaven, 1975, or Octavia E. Butler's Parable of the Solar from 1993, to name just a few, reveals a strong tendency in climate fiction to look forward into the future, to confront, through the power of the literary imagination, the challenges that humanity may face as a result of environmental degradation. Despite the evolution of the subgenre in the 21st century, this pattern persists in recent climate fiction, like Alexis Wright's The Swan Book, 2013, Kim Stanley Robinson's The Ministry of the Future, 2020, while Richard Powers' influential contributions to this genre, such as The Overstory, 2018, or his most recent book, Playground, follow a trajectory that begins in the past but ultimately concludes by contemplating the probable futures that emerge from those conditions. In The Bell of the World, by contrast, much of the book's opening two-thirds is set in the year 1910, before the narrative shifts dramatically in its last section to the 1960s, so that the novel avoids any of the speculations that usually characterize climate fiction. Day undertakes this seemingly counterintuitive move so that rather than focusing on the pulsating thrill of apocalyptic horrors of environmental disaster, he can instead ask other questions about the conditions that made prophecies of such a dire future possible. Rather than riling out readers to emerge from their apathy and take urgent steps to prevent imminent disaster, Day focuses on considering whether a lack of receptivity rather than a lack of action may be the root problem. A misguided corrective that preserves the problematic problematic relationship between society and nature, as Herschel observes with the revolutionaries of 1968 in a Sand Archive, has often provided the cover for a counter-revolutionary backlash that often makes things even worse than they were before. The dispute over the installation of the bell in the Bell of the World provides a basic template for the different ways of thinking about climate change that Day is proposing. One that is grounded not in the urgency of action, but in the primary importance of a new ethics of receptivity. The figure who embodies this dynamic in the novel is the protagonist, Sarah Hutchinson, a precocious young woman who lives on the Ngungahook farm with her Uncle Fernie, the aforementioned Uncle Fernie. The daughter of an alcoholic mother and an emotionally distant father, Sarah has spent several years at a boarding school in England where she feels alienated and depressed. The opening of the novel recounts her return to Australia from England, with a brief but glorious interlude in Rome, during which she loses her virginity to an elderly painter, Huazot, and fraternizes with the kind of avant-garde aesthetes that Uncle Fernie had fallen in with. Russolo, the noise artist, Sultano, the futurist, and so on. Upon arriving back in Australia, Sarah initially stays at a place called Big Cutting, in a house occupied by an Indigenous woman named Maisie, who has been tasked by Fernie with the job of restoring his niece's mental and physical health. Sarah overcomes her melancholy by reconnecting with the land, in particular by absorbing its sounds, permitting the invisible frequencies they say, and allowing them to vibrate through her being. She then channels these sounds into her creative endeavors, writing experimental poetry about the Australian bush and inserting found objects into the strings of her piano, including a bullock bone, a piece of ironbark, a banksia cob, a scrap of 8-gauge wire, a kangaroo rib, a train ticket, a fray of crinoline, a bandage, a letter, fern fronds, a bride hasp, and fox fur. So that the music the instrument generates constitutes a strange hybrid of nature and culture. Sarah's opposition to the bell's installation is rooted not so much in the lessons of her family history as it is for Fernie, as in her adoption of a radical ethics of receptivity. This new perspective allows her to diagnose Atchison's proposal of installing a bell as a sign of his obstinate failure to listen, an attitude that leads in turn to his inability to recognize how the so-called silence of nature is actually filled with sound. A bell focalizes an illusion, Sarah explains to her uncle after Atchison's departure, creating a false impression of the oneness of the world when actually it's teeming. By carefully listening to her surroundings, Sarah concludes not only that there is an eternal music in nature that renders true silence impossible, but also that this music necessarily derives from a chorus of different instruments rather than a single source. As a result, she concludes, the seductive power of the music of nature, this polyphonic bell of the world, must not be drowned out by the oppressively monotonous bell that Atchison is proposing. I, however, would like to linger for a moment on the bell that passes, the way a wave exhales as if with universal relief as it hits the shore. These are the deeper sighs, the passing bells we listen to every evening, untroubled by the fixative intent of humankind. My ears rejoice in a music nobody made, just as Selwyn Atchison himself regrets the same, and repeatedly bothers his wife as a consequence. He will not give up, yet the consolation I take is that neither will the waves. In the end, it will be he who is drowned out, along with the rest of us. For such passing bells as that don't pass at all. Sarah's ethics of receptivity thus dovetails with Fernie's resistance to colonization, with both characters contesting the imposition of a social order that obstinately refuses to acknowledge a reality that already indubitably exists. The same delusional impulse that leads Atchison to call for the installation of a bell to bring order to the silence of nature thus mirrors the disingenuous reasoning by which Australia was legally declared in 1835 to be terra nullius, an empty land, despite the continuous presence there of indigenous peoples for more than 60,000 years. What the colonial settlers thought of as the equivalent of passing bells, to use Sarah's phrase, may have been overlooked, but they have never disappeared, with neither the music of nature nor the songlines of the indigenous peoples ceasing to perform their enduring tunes. These lessons from the past provide a receptivity toward the future that marks Sarah's character as the model for a subjective revolution, a blood-buzzing still point that allows access to other personages that are as much of the future as you. She ponders the moon, hears the call of a bubuk owl, just as it did in the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, a recurrent present that seems to eliminate time, leaving her here where there is no epoch or eternity, where we have never been modern. Of course, the allusion is to Bruno Latour. Only a single wheel of perpetually revolving day and night. These insights recall similar moments in Day's earlier fiction, in Archipelago of Souls. For instance, when the characters speak about their emotional pain, these testimonies are reinforced by the polyphonic music of the environment, a kind of natural chorus that affirms the process of healing from tragedy. As the character of Leone in that book recounts her memories to the protagonist Wesley, Day writes that he listened, and the very sea around us seemed to grow rich with a buttressing wisdom against what I believed was the violence of human society. In a Sand Archive, moreover, Herschel is inspired by reading about an approach to music which decreed that if you wanted to understand sound, you should study not the bell or hammers or strings of an instrument, but the ear which hears what it plays. He transposes this musical logic onto his work as an engineer, so that instead of focusing on built structures, roads, bridges, all the physics of engineering pathways and crossings, he chooses an approach that requires him to think about what was under the roads, what perceived the roads, what came first. He was going to study the ontology of dunes. The difference between Sarah Hutchison and these earlier characters lies in her intense and unreserved receptiveness to the moment. Evident in the fearless way she steps into what she calls the molten wedding dress of here, the living flame at the crossroads of a present, both before and beyond my time, and thus I'm able to resonate into the future, she says. One might expect, given his preoccupations with nature, together with the pointed criticisms of the shortcomings of modern life, and the occasional nods that we've seen to William Blake, that Day's intellectual framework would most likely be rooted in some mode of romanticism. However, apart from some minor allusions to Byron and the references to Blake in Archipelago of Souls, the Romantics seem to have much less of an influence than one might expect on his fiction. Instead, as becomes increasingly explicit in Day's more recent books, the driving impetus of his climate fiction is drawn from an extensive engagement with modernism. Again, in an interview, he says, "When I was young, I read The Man Who Loved Children by Christina Stead. Christina Stead, one of the most important Australian modernist writers. 3 times in 12 months, it had a huge impact on me," reflects Day. And then beyond that, probably the book that's had the most impact on me is Joseph Furphy's Such Is Life. Again, another Australian modernist classic. So these 2 classics of Australian modernism, published in 1940 and 1903 respectively, established this period of literature as the crucial influence on Day's work, with the latter novel also playing a crucial role in the narrative, of course, of The Belle of the World. Such Is Life, of course, is Uncle Fernie, the character we mentioned before, Uncle Fernie's favourite book, a work which he reads aloud with admiration every day, evangelizing about its merits to everyone who crosses his path, and which accompanies him in his travels across the globe. The result of this prolonged and intense usage is that Fernie's copy of Such Is Life is starting to fall apart. And after the Bell incident has been resolved, he and Sarah journey across the country to a bookbinder known as Jones of Moolap to have it rebound. Published in 1903 and ignored at the time of its publication, Furphy's classic is a precursor to Australian modernism, even as it draws on stories of rural life familiar from realist contemporaries like Henry Lawson and Andrew Banjo Patterson. Furphy takes his title from the bushranger Ned Kelly's famous word. So, I mean, this is like the Australian equivalent of c'est la vie, right? But one of the most famous figures in Australian history, Ned Kelly, bushranger, basically a kind of 19th century colonial criminal, when he was asked for his last words before he was hanged, said, "Such is life," right? That was his c'est la vie, right? You know, that's his attitude towards this. So he takes his title from Ned Kelly, these famous last words, showing how beneath the motto's bleak stoicism, there is actually also a subversive irony that pervades the Australian mindset. He thus departs from the entrenched Victorian mode of social realism through the book's subversive humour, epitomized by its famous opening line, "Unemployed at last." Right? You can see it's reproduced even on the cover. Right? For non-Australian readers, the novel perhaps most closely resembles the wit of someone like Mark Twain, right, with its comically sensitive protagonist, Tom Collins, replacing things like the curse word bloody, right, with the ill-fitting substitute sanguinary. Right? This kind of makes sense, but it's not etymologically correct. And also referring to water, instead of calling it water, he calls it the oxide of hydrogen, right? This playful deployment of language is reflected not only in the experimental way Furphy unfolds his narratives, but also in the subtle treatment of taboo subjects such as homosexuality and gender fluidity, as well as the inclusion of different voices in a way that anticipates James Joyce's Ulysses, these disparate stories all woven together into a beautiful and strange polyphony. Furphy's willingness to include such radically heterogeneous elements corresponds with Day's argument that all works are formed by a creative process of reassembling in new ways what already exists. I think, in a way, literature is a type of compost, he states, and that we're all writing each other's books and the books of the past. This insight takes on a drastic new meaning in The Belle of the World when Fernie and Sarah return to the bookbinder to pick up the restored volume of Such is Life, only to find that Jones of Moolap has interwoven Furphy's novel with a copy of Herman Melville's Moby Dick. The histories of these two books actually resemble each other in curious ways. Both were initially neglected upon publication before eventually being recognized as classics of their respective national literatures, for example. Fernie reads aloud from these interleaving texts, and Sarah immediately notices the harmonic logic of the bookbinder's eccentric undertaking. In other words, the books fit together in this kind of harmony. While he's preparing to rebind the book, recounts Jones of Moolap, bells began going off in my mind, and a certain similarity began to dawn on me with this other special book in my possession, which is equally as elemental in both quality and mise-en-scène, yet somehow as perfectly and symmetrically adjacent to your own book as night is to day, indeed as land is to the ocean. The bookbinder's grand vision of combining Such is Life and Moby Dick provides the template for a new mode of integration that could bring all things into what he calls a book of the world, no less, or should I say, of the whole earth. It's not just that the two works bring into harmony earth and water, north and south, whale and bullock. They also represent the possibility of a restoration of the proper relationship between society and nature. Although this project emerges from the fertile seeds of Romanticism, Sarah's question as they approach the bookbinder, what is being but an ear, for instance, is taken from Emily Dickinson's poem, I Felt a Funeral in My Brain. And if you look, this is Dickinson's poem here. The actual line before that is, as all the heavens were a bell, right? So you can sort of see the more you dig into these references, the more you find these little extra clues. But the ultimate germination of these seeds of Romanticism always coincides for Day with the advent of modernism. This idea finds its fullest expression in a sand archive, starting with Herschel's obsessive research into sand dunes that begins, for some reason, with Marcel Proust and proceeds with Sisyphean persistence, so that after he had, quote, pushed Proust up the hill, he proceeded through Orwell, Musel, Cervantes, Dante, Isambard Kingdom Brunel, Simone Weil, Brodel, Thomas Telford, Duras, and Sarraute. These authors open his eyes to the dilemmas of the modern world, and so his reading choices naturally change after his life-changing experiences in France. From that point on, he becomes interested in what may be called cynical literature, which leads him to read Huysmans and Benjamin, Fourier, Baudelaire, and even Xavier Herbert, famous Australian author, in order to explain that streak in him, writes Day. Anything that would help explain how he had stepped out of the river of people, away from the spectacle of the great situationist movement, was of great personal interest to him. Yet even this pointed withdrawal is framed by two modernist illusions, right? The image of stepping into a river of people is taken from Baudelaire's prose poem, The Generous Gambler, Le Joueur Généreux, the opening of which Herschel copies into his diary. While the second, of course, is Guy Debord's Society of the Spectacle, La Société du Spectacle, a brilliant book that is now, of course, haunted by Debord's despairing suicide. The narrator of A Sand Archive ultimately insists that Herschel is quietly heroic in the style of Camus' heroes, that we must regard his Sisyphean life of stoic simplicity as happy. Yet Herschel himself seems somewhat unconvinced by this conclusion, as evidenced by his need at the end of the novel to visit the Netherlands, to Domburg, to reflect on his life choices. Like, did he do the right thing in leaving Mathilde? Like, did he write, all these kinds of things. The Belle of the World may thus be read as an attempt to redress this apparent ambivalence, with Sarah emerging from the shadows of her colonial melancholy to become a positive force who brings life and energy to the world around her. Sarah embodies Day's vision of a reconciliation of the romantic impulse to restore the balance of society and nature, and the modernist impulse to revolutionize subjective experience by acknowledging their collective and discontinuous qualities. It is during Sarah's stint in Rome, where she mixes with a disparate group of avant-garde artists, that she learns how later to connect with her natural surroundings upon returning to Australia. The characters she encounters there include the real-life noise artist, Luigi Russolo, author of a manifesto titled The Art of Noises, from 1913, a futurist named Sultano, which I couldn't find any real-life equivalent for, and an elderly painter named Paul Huizeau, with whom Sarah has a brief affair. It is from Huizeau in particular that she learns to see the world with new eyes. He would say, for instance, that he preferred unfinished to finished paintings, declaring that most painters knew how only to ruin and strip the life out of their own creations. Huizeau's paintings, which were typically very small canvases, not all of which were entirely painted in, often included words as well as imagery. He once said that a painting of his was left in what one critic had called a naked state, because it could only ever be finished with a flourish, not of color, but of music. The experiences like these in Rome provide Sarah with a new perspective on life that brings out her instinctive flair for freedom. If, in Huizeau's case, a painting could be finished not by another daub of paint, not by a final and deliberately oblique visual intimation, but by a flourish of music, then Sarah was exactly that, the flourish of music from the air outside the frame, writes Day. And as far as Sarah was concerned, Huizeau exhibited the life of someone quite outside the printed templates of age and convention. Pointing to the Tiber River in Rome while out walking with her elderly lover, she muses how its flowing water symbolizes the connectedness of everything at the same time, now and then and tomorrow, always the same river. joining not only the different branches of time, but also society and nature, art and life. Now, the figure of Oiseau is not a purely fictional character, but rather is drawn by Day from the life of the fairly thinly veiled portrait of the life, drawn from the life of the French modernist painter Paul Cézanne. Paul Oiseau, Paul Cézanne, right? Cézanne had such a notorious habit of not completing his paintings that in 2000, an exhibition of his works titled Cézanne Finished, Unfinished, see the book that resulted from that, was held at the Kunstforum in Vienna, while in Émile Zola's novel, L'Œuvre, the masterpiece in English as it's translated, the protagonist, Claude Lantier, a character also inspired by Cézanne, commits suicide by hanging himself from the big ladder in front of his unfinishable masterpiece. Day begins his 2017 essay, Mere Scenery and Pools of Light, by contemplating Cézanne at length, arguing that it is incorrect to view the late pictures he made of the sea at L'Estaque, where the painter went on holiday as a boy, as a sentimental return. Cézanne was not a cathartic artist, Day contends. So in his pictures, he was a sworn enemy of pictorial nostalgia and a relentless warrior against mere scenery. What particularly interests Day is how Cézanne's pioneering role as a progenitor of modern art, with its worship of the self-obsessed and subjective view, is accompanied by his habit of immersing himself in nature. The painter's walks, this is kind of the focus of the essay that he writes, is like several different famous figures who used walking as a kind of walking in nature as an inspiration. So he says the painter's walks were not artist's escapes or spiritual retreats, but confrontations. He became not only urgently industrious, but as a consequence, determinedly antisocial, not only anti-bourgeois, but in the proto-yuppie era of the Second Empire, anti-imperial. His great friend Pissarro's cry to burn the Louvre was actually a call to go walking. The whole plein air impulse of the 1870s was not an optical issue alone, nor one for the linearity of canons or the modernity of which he is now seen as the father. Cézanne seemed assured in the fact that the original multi-timbre and deep state of nature would always outlast the monologues of fashion, capitalism, the Republic, and the father. Day holds up Cézanne as a counterexample to the dominant idea that modernism after Baudelaire marks a self-conscious turn away from nature to explore only the urban spaces of the city. The landscape thinks itself in me, and I am its consciousness, he quotes. And this line from Cézanne epitomizes how his innovative perspective allows us to see a radically new way that challenges the gap between society and nature. In a sand archive, it is Mondrian, Piet Mondrian, rather than Cézanne, who carries Day's unconventional interpretation of modernism. Mondrian might appear initially to be a more difficult case to make, certainly than Cézanne, since the abstract geometrical lines and simple primary colors that characterize his most famous pictures form a rigorous artifice from which all nature seems to have been eliminated. Nonetheless, as Herschel stands before the youthful pictures of dunes that Mondrian painted, he reflects on how the Dutch artists believe that the beauty of nature affects not just the visual realm, but acts upon all our senses simultaneously, a difficult admission for a painter to make, and one that eventually led Mondrian to abandon figurative representation entirely. The observation that really touches Herschel's emotions most deeply, however, comes from Mondrian's essay called Natural Reality and Abstract Reality, an essay in trialogue form, in which he writes, "We are no longer natural enough to be quite one with nature, but not yet sufficiently spiritual to be quite free of nature." Published in serial form between 1919 and 1920, this text unfolds as a three-way conversation, the trialogue, the unusual word in the title, between three figures, X, a naturalistic painter, Y, a layman, and Z, or Z, an abstract real painter. So Z obviously being the mouthpiece or stand-in for Mondrian himself. And so the trialogue takes place as they're supposedly walking from the country to the city. The other two are surprised when Zed expresses his admiration for the beauties of nature. Since you no longer depict nature, I thought nature no longer meant anything to you. That's Y says that to him. Zed replies that, on the contrary, nature moves me deeply, and that he just paints it differently. He then explains how his approach to painting is based on the principle that the more the natural is abstracted, the more pronounced is the expression of relationship, and that for him, relationship is precisely more alive when it is not veiled by the natural, but manifests itself in the flat and the straight. Far from being a retreat into a purely synthetic and unnatural space, then, Mondrian's abstract painting is positioned from the outset in his theoretical writing as a new approach to nature, one that attempts to grasp its outlines more truly by breaking with the restraints of verisimilitude. If Cézanne and Mondrian provide the initial template for a modernist reconciliation with nature, this idea reaches its culmination in the final section of The Bell of the World, which jumps ahead from 1910, which we saw in the earlier parts of the book, to the 1960s, when an elderly Sarah, now living in hermetic near solitude, as she calls it, on the farm she has inherited from her uncle, begins a correspondence in Natural History magazine with an American man initially known only as your Stony Point correspondent. If you don't know, Stony Point is near New York City. This exchange deepens and intensifies as the two start to exchange letters directly, the primary subject of their epistolary conversation being how fungi form global networks that connect the whole planet. Kind of trendy topic in ecological theory these days. The Stony Point correspondent is not some random mushroom enthusiast, as it turns out, but a fictional version of the modernist composer John Cage, who's surprised to learn that Sarah anticipated his experimental prepared piano experiment by some 3 decades. So you can see there John Cage inserting various screws and other things into the strings of the piano in order to change its sounds. And of course, we remember I quoted earlier, Sarah putting all sorts of natural objects into the piano to change its sounds as well. So Cage did this originally in 1940, but Sarah was supposedly fictionally doing it in 1910. As with his modernist precursors, Day regards Cage's hobby of collecting mushrooms, which includes a book titled A Mycological Foray, which has since been sort of republished in this very luxurious and very expensive new edition, published that in 1972, as a logical extension of his attitude towards musical composition, in which the ability to hear the music of nature, the bell of the world, forms the conceptual nucleus of the experimental modernist task of probing the limits of human subjectivity. At the end of the novel, Sarah travels to Melbourne to hear John Cage, whom, as far as I can tell, I read his biography, did not go to Australia. But anyway, she travels to Melbourne to hear John Cage. He even provides her with tickets to the event to perform his work, where the threads of the novel are drawn together in the form of a big black Steinway in the center of the stage, standing there like a bullock in a field of ryegrass, or a whale breaching a moon-beamed ocean, right? Of course, remembering that the bullock is the central sort of animal in Such Is Life, Joseph Murphy's book, which was then bound together with Moby Dick, of course, which is the whale. So there is this piano brings together these two earlier themes, these two earlier symbols. Cage's most famous piece, 4 minutes and 33 seconds, which if you don't know it, involves him sitting at a piano and allowing the sounds of the environment to come in. He doesn't actually play anything on the piano, and sitting there listening to your environment for 4 minutes and 33 seconds, gathers the sounds of nature, binding them together with Furphy's bullocks and Melville's whale. This performance is a logical conclusion of the novel's ethics of receptivity, calling on the inhabitants of the modern world to remember how to listen to what is always there, to recall that we are all musician listeners, creating and being created by what is around us. The power of Day's novel lies in its insistence on learning how to experience the present moment, in which the force of the here and now lies in the radical fact of its here-ness. For in the world of true and natural music, there are no mistakes. Day points out that the true problem lies in the fact that, as I said at the beginning, that we have lost the ability to be receptive because our environment is constantly filled with artificial bells that distract us. Sarah could hear the cacophony of the city as she's sitting there listening to 4 minutes and 33 seconds, from the dull thrum of cards to the squeal of a tram, the constant clanging intrusion of the modern. Cage's genius is to act as the unplayer, right, who cuts through the noise and thus shows the necessity of becoming receptive, revealing the cousinliness, as Day calls it, shared between one single second and the whole of eternity, was now so proven by modernity, by what some ancients knew as the cold truth of Styx. The purveyors of Day's version of modernism were right that life at every point in history has always been a radical and discontinuous experiment, that we are all and always have been naturally surreal, as Cage refers to Sarah. Strange little nodes that, like mushrooms, connect around the globe. For Gregory Day, actions alone are not going to solve the climate crisis. It is only by learning to become receptive that we have any chance of overcoming the self-destructive impulses that drive modern humanity and thus restoring the balance between society and culture. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very rich, very fascinating, captivating presentation, not only of Gregory Day's The Bell of the World, but his other main books as well. And it was extremely illuminating to hear of the Stella Archive, the words of R. Eagle, etc. I was struck also by a red thread about your mentioning two main influences, Romanticism on the one hand and modernism on the other. Actually, I was really struck by the romantic strains in a lot of passages. And you mentioned that apart from Blake, there are not that many references, but still, if you think of a Wordsworth, this idea in the prelude of being creator and receiver both of this filial bond between man and nature, this is very present in the novel. And I wanted to hear more from you about this fascination also with the senses. We discussed this at lunch. There is a fascinating critical book that maybe some of you have heard of, which is called by David Abram, "The Spell of the Spell of the Sensuous," where he mentions the fact that stories, they have to make sense, but not in the meaning that we would normally attach to making sense, having a definite meaning at the end, but more this idea of a sort of mystical meaning being precisely in being in communion with nature, also being able to feel through your senses, and to have these connections. So I wondered if you could tell us a little more about how, in the novel and in the writing of the novel, Day manages to pass from a more romantic approach to the relationship of man to nature to this modernist approach that you mentioned. Okay.
I'm going to do so by stepping a little bit away from Gregory Day and maybe a little bit into my own biography, because when I was studying as a postgrad student, I actually was studying French literature and theory, and my it's very nice to come here in some ways, because my favorite author that I wrote about a lot of my PhD dissertation was Stendhal. So Stendhal, Balzac, Flaubert, and of course reading lots of French theory, and that was the focus of my PhD dissertation. And then when I had to go out into the big world and get a job, I realized, especially since I had just moved to the United States, that I needed to, that my French was okay, but was not good enough to be a professor of French literature. So I had to become an expert in Anglophone literature instead. And I thought for a few years that I was going to be a scholar of D.H. Lawrence. And a lot of the kind of critique that we see in Gregory Day's work, even though he doesn't reference Lawrence directly, is very, very similar to what we see in D.H. Lawrence, right? And D.H. Lawrence has a very similar critique of Romanticism, which is that, of course, he's inspired by the romantic interest in nature, and he understands the impulse of sort of modern alienation that drives the romantics to seek this. But Lawrence's critique is that the romantics always followed only their idea of what nature is, rather than actually connecting with what the natural world is actually doing, right? So instead of, when I teach this idea to students, I tell them, like, imagine if I said to you, be natural, and you immediately start, what does it mean? Does this look like, am I being natural now, right? And because immediately you have to start thinking what the natural is rather than just being naturally, right? And this is the same critique that Lawrence makes then of the romantics, is like, oh, we want to return to nature, and this is my idea of nature, but it's an idea that is an artificial idea rather than allowing true nature to come through. So what I think Gregory Day is doing, as I said, is quite similar to this same kind of critique, but I think there is an element of caricature, I guess you could call it, that is coming through more in this book, like that James and I were talking about last night. Particularly, I didn't get to talk about it, but the scenes with the naturalists who come from the big city, right? And they come and they visit the Gungahook farm, and they invited in by Sarah and her uncle to go in and study the local nature. And what they do is they go out and they just slaughter all these animals and birds and plants, and they and they put into practice, speaking of Wordsworth, like that idea of to murder to dissect, right? They basically they are looking to study nature, but in so doing, they're destroying nature in this very sort of ironic way. So I think that's where Day sees the shortcomings of a lot of Romanticism, is that it has the right sort of, as I said, I think I called it the seeds of Romanticism, that there's something that is planted there by Romanticism, but that hasn't fully come to its fruition yet, that they don't quite necessarily grasp the right way to approach nature, that he then sees in the three figures I mentioned, Cézanne, Mondrian, and of course John Cage. And of course there are others as well that he talks about in more depth, particularly in his non-fiction writings, which are collected together in the Words Are Eagles book. But yeah, I think that's the sort of the connection, right? Is that the Romanticism has a right impulse, but wrong, like sort of perspective or methodology to actually fix the problem. Whereas he sees in modernism not a rejection of nature, but an attempt to create a new perspective that allows us to see nature in a much more receptive and realistic way. Like, yeah.
I would have another and many other questions, but maybe before I suggest other questions, are there any questions from the floor, from the students? So while you're thinking about questions, possible questions, listening to you, this really makes me think that as far as Cézanne, Mondrian, and John Cage are concerned, and also Emily Dickinson that you mentioned, there is this idea of something that is left unfinished, open. There is also the play with silence, and it seems to me that precisely that's what is so viscerally engaging in this book, that there is room for us readers also, and we are invited to make our own creation. And just as Jones of Moolap interleaves one page from his life with one page from Moby Dick in a sort of extraordinary and extremely audacious hybrid creature, but it works. And those unexpected links between the ocean and the bush, the bullock and the whale, etc. All of this is extremely convincing. At one point, Sarah Hutchinson is tempted to do the same. She finds a book, and she thinks she might do the same. And there is a direct address to readers to also do this. And I was moved by that because, as you said, this really engages us to listen, but to listen not to something that would be, from a romantic perspective, the sort of divine dimension of nature, but also something that is highly personal. I was struck by one of the quotes you gave in which about perspective, that it's really about this multiple perspective, that the best way of listening is to realize that there are so many ways of listening, so many ways of inserting little elements from nature, from culture, and creating your own music that is, you spoke of polyphony, and it really celebrates polyphony, it seems to me. And I was also struck by the fact that the approach is quite close, actually, with this idea of interconnectedness, of the past, the present, and the future being all co-present, also of different places being simultaneously present, which is also something we find very often in modernism, with the focus on the stream of consciousness that we're here, but we also think about, I don't know, our Proustian Madeleine or whatever. And we have many such moments, and what I'm getting lost in my own, sorry, what I was getting at is the fact that, yes, we as readers are also enjoined to listen, but with our own inner ear, not just, we're not being taught, or, so I would like you to maybe say a little more about this use of pauses, of silence, and also of co-presence, different times, different places being present at the same time, and through music. And maybe also, because this is, you mentioned the fact that, if anything, this is a novel, not only is it chronologically speaking set at the beginning of the 20th century, but really at the end of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, music is really celebrated as the best form of art ever, because precisely music has this possibility of relating. You spoke of shedding light on relationship, and it seems to me that this is really what this novel does. So we wondered this afternoon, how does he manage to keep us in this whirlpool of references, quite complex ones, quite erudite ones at times, and with a lot of reflections about etymology, etc. And maybe it's through the music. Mm-hmm. So could you maybe elaborate on how the novel is structured, what keeps us reading and feels us being carried away in the music of the words?
That's a lot. That's a lot to talk about. I want to go back to something you just said a little earlier.
The silence.
Even before that, which is that, which has to do with there is one of the things I find fascinating about this book as an approach, particularly to something like climate change, which is, of course, is happening now, but also is often in climate fiction is about the future, as I mentioned, right? But what they really ask us to pay attention to is not just like the present moment, as sort of, Buddha's be present in the moment kind of thing, but rather that there is an argument also to be made from the here and now, from what exists, right? And that this has a more powerful argument to be made than what could be, than what has potential, like the actual versus the potential, right? And this is a big part, I think, of what the book is asking us to consider, is don't just think about what might be, what is potential, what could be. Begin from what actually exists? Like, what is actually here? What is now? What do we have here? Like, what are the parameters? What are the terms of this reality in which we're living in right now? So if you can understand that, like if you can if you can see that clearly, that is going to allow you to think, like, you know, and connect the dots to what the past and the future will be, right? Whereas the kind of thinking that I think he's implicitly sort of arguing against is simply just like, oh, this might be, this is, and that might also comes very often with a should, right? So like, this is what might happen, therefore we should take these actions, right? Whereas he's, as I said, he's taking a very different approach. No, this is the actual, and we have to focus upon like what is real, what is the actual, what is reality here, and being receptive to that in order to, you know, to work with that rather than try to impose some sort of ideal potential that might be, but that also might not be like that might be just a fantasy, right? As like he quite distinctively explores in A Sand Archive, like all of the sort of like revolutionary utopian proposals that are made turn out to be kind of both limited and also counterproductive in the way in which they actually change reality. Yeah. So there's this, for me, there's a certain like I find his early novels sometimes a little bit nail and chalkboard insofar as like there's an aspect of sort of like distinctively Roman Catholic spirituality that comes through, like from the way Day writes, especially, as I said, especially in those early novels like the Patron Saint of Eels and so on, where he's like really pushes this kind of like Catholic, spiritual, romantic like perspective, like about like how we should reconnect with nature and so on. And that has really like shifted in his work. So you can see that there are still references to God and spirituality and so on in The Belle of the World, but it's taken on, I would say, a more Spinozist kind of bent, right? Where again, where the emphasis is not on what could be, but upon like the emphasis upon like, you know, the here and now, and also a kind of equation of like that Spinoza makes of God and nature, right? Where there is not like some sort of there's no telos, right? There's no like this is our goal, right? Instead, the lesson that Sarah repeatedly learns, especially from listening to the waves, is like, well, no, there is no teleology, there is no end to this. There's no final purpose that nature has, and that this also should be how life is lived.
Which also connects with the fact that the novel starts with Sarah Hutchinson being completely lost, and this being very emblematic of this period, actually more after the First World War, where in Europe there was a major cultural and epistemological crisis, and she's lost her bearings for family reasons, but also because basically she doesn't know yet who she is. But she's then restored back to life and to her senses through the help of an indigenous Australian woman. And not surprisingly, she appears at the beginning, but also she closes the book and the loop is looped. And I felt this was quite touching, because if you think of it, I'm sure Alexis Wright would love this novel. I would be interested actually to hear her speak about this, because it seems to me that from another perspective and with other words, there is a lot in common between the songlines that you mentioned. Actually, there is this whole passage that I felt was a bit startling at first, where the narrator speaks about Sarah finding a sort of epiphany in thinking about the Pleiades, the Seven Sisters, and this is one of the major and the most common songlines in indigenous Australian culture. And I felt that it really helped reconnect all the threads. If you think of it, you didn't mention it, but and this was not so important, but it suggested that she's been deflowered by this elderly man who is a mentor, but at the same time, it's not quite unhealthy, but it's not very clear whether she was ready for it or not. And precisely this whole myth about the seven sisters is about seven sisters who are chased by a man who wants to marry them. In some versions, this is the father, so there is the taboo of incest. And they find refuge in the sky, and he never manages to catch them. And it's quite, I'm sure it's not a coincidence if Gregory Day should have chosen one of the most popular songlines and Aboriginal myth, and integrated into his own literary world, and in a way that is very respectful, it seems to me, and that is not shocking in any way, and that he also pays his respects, it seems to me, with this indigenous character Maisie at the beginning and the end of the novel, without intruding or also being possibly accused of cultural appropriation. But this is obviously a sort of touchy issue, so you have to tread carefully, because if anything, the indigenous Australians were there for have been on Australian in Australia for the last 60,000 years. So obviously their culture is much richer. Their deep knowledge of the place is also much more legitimate to that extent. But it seems to me, and Alex is right, this is what she does. It also, especially in Carpentaria, she opens up the possibility for the whole nation to reconcile around a common, deep, intimate connection with place. So I think this was interesting. And maybe you'd be interested to say more about how Aboriginal culture is represented, or the few references we have to Aboriginal people in the novel, or Maisie in particular.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, isn't it, that she is not in any way a didactic character.
No.
Like even to Sarah, when she comes back, she's not like, you need to eat, you need to do this. She's just like, just interacts with her in a very sort of natural and reserved sort of way. And it's only at the end of the book, as you mentioned, when she, like Maisie doesn't actually say anything. She just recalls hearing Maisie's song.
Yes.
Right, about the, what did she say, that the world's a nut. The world's a nut, and then you
Yes.
open it, and you have everything you need, right? This sort of, as I said, very Spinoza sort of idea that there's not that there's mistakes or it's not right or wrong. It's like there just is, just
Yes.
what exists,
Yeah.
and that's what the world gives you, right?
Maybe you could read the passage. It's a beautiful passage.
Sure. At the bottom of 403.
This, Sarah thought, this is Maisie's song. Do you want to read it?
Sure. This Sarah thought, this is Maisie's song. The world's a nut, she used to say to Sarah in her distress. The world's a nut until you open it. Then, she winked at Mr. Rabbit, who is her lover, then it's everything you need. And then she goes on to explain it a little bit more on the next page. To think, Sarah thought then, and to think again, and not for the first time, to think and think again as a wallaby finds her truffle. To think, she thought, looking intently at her correspondent up on the stage, to think of all that can be unleashed by doing nothing, by being, and that is how the nut is opened and all the fruits inside.
I mean, I have a really, probably quite banal question, but with all these themes about oneness and harmony with nature and receptivity, mindfulness, I suppose, in modern parlance, I was sort of wondering whether there were any novels of note from the 60s, for example, that came out around the time of the counterculture and the hippie movement, which had also this sort of kind of primitivism to it, I mean, at least superficially. Because you talked about, quite early on in the presentation, about novels which were from around that time, right? Like Ballard, for example, which were all sort of novels of disaster, climate disaster. But were there any people like engaging seriously with these ideas of, oneness with nature, but perhaps embracing something like a modernist style? from that period it was that you're aware of?
Well, I want to correct you on a couple of little things.
Please do.
Because even though it's like, you talked about harmony with nature and mindfulness and so on, like, Dave makes it very clear that this is not the same thing as those kind of like, 60s ideas. Right? These are like there is no, like, quite specifically it says no oneness. Like, nature is teeming, it's full of like all sorts of things. There's no oneness in nature, right? Remember, and that's quite specifically why Sarah rejects the idea of the bell, is that she says, the bell imposes this idea that there is everything one in nature, but actually it's teeming, it's full of different things. And so then the idea is that, like, again, it's not really harmony, it's more this kind of like polyphony. Right? It's like all these different voices interacting at once, and they're often not being orchestrated in any sort of way, or they're not being coordinated at all, but rather there's just like a whole lot of stuff going on, a whole lot of sounds coming from nature that are creating the music as a kind of spontaneous music.
Well, I suppose what I meant is sort of like, but allowing yourself to receive that, being open to it, not so much oneness, but kind of allowing it to wash over you, which is what I felt was one of the things that the novel encourages you to do, is just to sort of read and allow this sort of imagery just to kind of wash over you. But I just wondered if there was, anything that was comparable from that period, or if it's really a different kind of beast, the thinking of that time.
It does make me think of like the opening of Robert Musil's Man Without Qualities, right? Remember where Ulrich, the main character, just goes out into the street and he's like, I want to do nothing, right? And he's like, his constant effort is like, I want to do nothing. I don't want to do anything today, right? And it's like this paradoxical task of like the modern hero of like being no one and doing nothing is like the ultimate like difficult task to undertake, right? So actually,
do you agree? It's really difficult to do nothing. I don't know why I just turned to the students. That's probably unfair. Sorry.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt, Peter.
So I would have to think about it more and look through my library and think about like what books approach it in that way.
It was just interesting to see those examples of that kind of time. In fact,
Yeah.
Having such a negative view of the future, or at least projecting into the future and sort of anticipating the kinds of disasters that seem perhaps more tangible now than they did at the time that they were written. Yeah.
Yes, I think you probably have to go more into like, say, like an American like 60s and 70s sort of counterculture, someone like a Tom Robbins or something like that, who sort of borrows from like a Taoism and stuff like that, and sort of it's humorous, it's kind of serious, but it's also like has this sort of like it's humorous, but it has this undertone of like a sort of serious rethinking of similar ideas.
Thanks.
Yeah, sorry, I'm listening to it at the same time. I just had a more general question about the term climate fiction and what Gregory Day thinks of it, or how he's been classified. Is it a term that's been used for The Bell of the World or not? And because it's been coined, it was coined quite recently, so I tend to say that Ballard, for example, is climate fiction, but the term didn't exist at the time, so we tend to find a lot of climate fiction in science fiction, which is mostly disregarded as not real literature, etc. So I was just wondering, how this term climate fiction fits in with this novel, but also maybe other novels of his.
As you can probably tell from reading him, like Gregory Day is a fairly idiosyncratic writer. There's not like 1,000 Gregory Days out there writing this style of work. So it's hard to sort of like fit him into an easy label. Certainly, he would be seen as like a nature writer, someone who's constantly concerned with environmental issues in his work, those kinds of things. So whether that would strictly fit into like the kind of like very science fiction-y definitions of climate fiction as a sort of a confrontation with the apocalypse, I don't know. But I think there's an argument to be made that, I make the argument in my work that he's trying to think through these ideas because you can't really sort of like be a nature writer and write about the environmental degradation without thinking about that. I mean, it'd be kind of bizarre to sort of like ignore the central sort of question about time in relation to those things. So I think it's not the typical image that you might have of climate fiction, but I think that is definitely what he's doing, certainly in this book. And so like something like the previous book, like A Sand Archive, that's more about environmental degradation and those kinds of like imposition of like invasive species and stuff like that. Whereas this one definitely is starting to think more about like what that future would be, but how it's also rooted in these ways of seeing that have a history going back to like the early 20th century, at least in the context of this novel.
Yes, and I tend to, and what we were trying to do with James was also try and see what can be categorized as climate fiction with the S in brackets, because it's, you tend to think about the apocalypse or, post-apocalyptic worlds, but I think that this is a good example of something that could be classified as climate fiction, and so, so I think your answer is...
We were especially keen, in fact, that we had novels that looked also backwards and not just strictly forwards, because, of course, you can't really talk about what's happening without acknowledging the past. So that was a kind of perfect fit from that perspective.
Well, there's also a kind of like, there's been a shift over the last few decades in terms of like what we think of in relation to like something that is apocalyptic. Like my next book will be about Ian McEwan and notions of apocalypse. And like one of the things that's really clear with as someone who started writing in the 70s and 80s, like his early ideas about what apocalypse are all nuclear. Right? It's all about nuclear apocalypse. Then Shall We Die, of course, is the sort of a culmination of that, where he sort of like has this libretto about like nuclear annihilation. And then, of course, by the time you get to 2010 and he publishes Solar, it's all about like nuclear apocalypse. Who cares about that? Like it's all about like climate change and the way in which like that is going to destroy the end of the world. So like culturally, there's been like quite a notable shift when you look at someone like McEwan, who across the course of his life that has changed culturally, right? So that we can look back at those early precursors like Ballard or like The Death of Grass, John Christopher and so on, and we can see like the precursors to that. But it wasn't like the central thing that people thought that was how the world was going to end in the 70s and 80s, in the period that sort of predates the rise of climate fiction. So it's very curious to see how like a new permutation of the apocalypse has come about in terms of the rise of that category.
I'm actually curious as to whether there will be a resurgence, in fact, of novels or films related to the idea of nuclear apocalypse, because one film that was made in the early 80s for the BBC, maybe you know about it, Threads, which was published now exactly 40 years ago, 1980. Sorry, it wasn't published, it was broadcast just once in 1984. Has sort of started to kind of enjoy is a strong word here, new audiences. I mean, it's probably the most harrowing piece of film I've ever seen in my life. It imagines a nuclear bomb landing on Sheffield. And it's written by Barry Hines, who wrote the book on which Kes by Ken Loach is based. And there seems to be a lot of kind of renewed interest in this. But I don't know if that has sort of filtered through into literature at all as well. But it's interesting how that and also Peter Watkins' The War Games, which was a sort of a mockumentary, if you like, in the late 60s, have sort of found new audiences, and people refer to them quite regularly on social media as a kind of cultural reference for our sort of anxious times, because of course now we're dealing with two fronts, both the climate situation but also the geopolitical situation, which is obviously very nervous at the moment.
Also people from our generation too, like When the Wind Blows, the cartoon. Like, I mean, you encounter that as a child, and you think it's a cartoon. Like, this is for children. It's like terrifying. It's like these two old people who survive. Like, well, they don't survive. They for the short time in the book they survive like a nuclear nuclear bomb. And
when would that have been published roughly? Was it
86.
86, yeah.
Yeah.
That was
So,
the time,
yeah.
Questions?
Yes, go ahead.
I was interested on the sensorial parts, would you say?
And I wanted to ask why they is actually focusing more on sounds rather than images, because actually also nature is landscape, and I don't know, that's the question. Why he is interested in sounds rather than images
And actually,
eyes.
he often speaks of a soundscape.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, that's right.
So that's the question.
Well, I think I think he's kind of, partly it's because he's chosen John Cage as his sort of central figure in here, and there's that notion of, as I said, of receptivity, of learning to listen. But if you remember in the conversations that Sarah has with Huazo, he talks about like him creating these unfinished paintings, and that they could only be finished by like a piece of music, right? As if like music could be put onto a canvas in this way. And there seems to be like, not that there's a choice of one medium over the other, but rather that there is the same sort of principles are applying to, like, whether it comes to painting landscapes like a Mondrian or Cézanne, or creating music like John Cage's, that both involve a similar, as it says, similar kind of receptivity to just like seeing or hearing what actually exists around you, rather than what has been imposed by a sort of a utopian vision upon what that should be. Yes. I think it's also probably much easier to sort of grasp music that is not created, as it were. Like, because when you have like a painting, you're always just going to have a lot of like blank canvases if you just have like, okay, I'm not going to do nothing. But with Cage's 4 minutes 33, the performance is always different, because there's always different background noises and always different things coming from the environment. So it's sort of, I guess, also an easier way to illustrate the principle that he's trying to put forward.
And also, I think, because there is this spun metaphor along the novel around the idea of sounds and the impact they have on the listeners. So sound and echo, sound and silence. So the idea that there is this sort of invisible mesh that we're in, but that very often we don't realize we're in, because precisely we're distracted by all those bells, artificial bells, even smartphones or whatever.
Yes.
And that we should really close all of this down, shut all of this down, precisely to reconnect to the most simple vibrations. And I think if effectively, as far as a metaphor, it works well, this idea of a little sound, and then it provokes a ripple effect and a series of undulations, and you cannot fix a word or a meaning. It remains more intangible, more abstract, more mystical, and it leaves also this space for each person to have it resonate in a different manner. Actually, I don't know what to make of it, but when I read the passage about Maisie, I don't know if you've noticed, but she doesn't say much, and very often there are many references to words, to sounds she makes with her throat, as being gurgling, and the spun metaphor of water, rain, storm, both destroying and regenerating in the same way as it is used in Alexis Wright's Carpentaria, it is very much linked also to all these images of cycles, and the fact that we should, as you said early on, in the West we tend to have a lot of teleologies, progress, democracy, or whatever. But sometimes with such ideals we are more and more disconnected from the here and now. And it seems to me that in this book, Gregory Day wants us to reconnect with the very flow of things and to take what comes, and sometimes it's difficult and maybe we'll be wiped out or nearly wiped out and we'll have to reinvent ourselves. And to that extent, I think we could say that it's in this whole vein of climate fiction. We know that we are at a turning point. We don't know whether we'll manage to do anything else than drown and come back to the surface, but we'll have to navigate. And to that extent, Alexis Wright's own novel, Carpentaria, is very hopeful in its own paradoxical way. Yes, there is a storm, but there is the possibility of starting a new life on this makeshift island, etc., etc. And maybe that's not exactly what is suggested, but even actually, I kept thinking of Woolf when reading Gregory Day. I don't know if you remember, in Mrs. Dalloway, there is this mysterious character, the old woman, singing of past love, and she's also referred to as this very old, nobody knows exactly how old she could be, from the first time of humankind as a sort of primitive spring. And we have very similar images. And also the idea in Mrs. Dalloway that the whole world is dying, and that after the First World War, that realizing that the West will have to reinvent itself, and it's no coincidence if we have the wasteland with Eliot's using so many images having to do with winter, spring being no more, and being civilization being a field of bones and being in rags, etc. So, and maybe the possibility of renewal, rebirth, but still indefinite.
Yes. You can see there's an implicit tension in writing a novel about having no telos, having no end.
Yes.
Because, how is it going to keep our attention if it's going to, if it's going to be just a novel meandering, saying anything, doing anything? So there's implicit tension there. It's I want to show a world in which we learn about from nature that there is no telos, so that there is no end, there is no progress to some particular point. But at the same time, I need to do this in my storytelling in order to hold your attention. So
yes, that's right.
Yeah.
I mean, just a real quick question. John Cage and his prepared piano, have you actually listened to any of these pieces?
I have, yeah.
Can you describe it to us in any way? I mean, is it melodious in the least, or is it totally discordant?
It's not meant to be.
No, it's something you listen to once and then you're like, okay.
I get it.
I
get the idea. It's not like Sarah in the novel, for example, who plays this extraordinary music and everyone sort of comes out of their rooms and comes to listen, because it's obviously, I assume it's supposed to be beautiful, but I mean, it's whatever it does, it casts a kind of spell on that.
Yes.
Yeah.
I guess we might call it a day.
Maybe.
Thank you so very much. Final clap.
Yes.